Good morning, everyone. Today is Tuesday, February 1st, and it's 10:16 a.m. This is a meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We are picking up back on a topic of longtime work and interest, and that is forestry. So people who have been following our work this session know that we have an Act 250 bill, and a lot of the conversation has been focused on the first half of that bill, which talks about the development of housing and planning oriented to developed areas of the state. The second half of that bill, though, is near and dear to this committee, and that is work on preserving the green spaces of the state of Vermont. And particularly, we're talking about forest and forest land. So we had a very brief conversation a couple of weeks ago on it. I asked Commissioner Snyder to come back in and Mr. Hancock to help us take a deeper dive on actionable steps that we might consider in this bill. It could be something we would add to this bill, or it might be that we realize it's beyond the scope of this bill, but we take steps now to put ourselves in a better position to act either later this session or even next year. So with that, I'd like to turn it to Commissioner Snyder, who about a year ago actually helped us with a very helpful report that I'm hoping we can go back to this morning. It summarized a lot of the work that's been going on since the seminal 2015 report on forestry. So good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Thanks for coming back in.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Good morning, all. Thanks for your continued interests in forests and forestry. And as ever, I'm appreciative and also quite interested and happy to try to help. I'm pleased to see that you have some policy pieces that you've included, right, in S234. Shall I just start? What would be most helpful? I can kind of speak to those that are there now and then pivot to other things maybe. How would you like me to go?
Probably it'd be good to touch on what's there, just so that we've talked about those. And I don't know if you want to use your report from 2021 or entirely up to you.
Okay. We've
given ourselves a pretty good chunk of time here to be able to work on an hour and a half. So
super. Well, I can be very brief there. I'm certainly always happy to take questions and all, but on the provisions that the sections in the bill now that speak to forests and forestry there, if I have this right, I believe there are three that are directly, implicating forests somehow. So there's the forest fragmentation or anti-forest fragmentation language that would create a new criterion within Act 250, creating, what we've referred to and I think even called for in that 2015 report, a forest lens in the Act 250 version of land use planning and regulation. Whereas there's 9C, a criterion relating to productive forest soils. It's little used. It doesn't get at the same issues of forest integrity, connectivity, function, and value. It's more about productive forestry operations, which is important, but again, little used. So to be consistent and to be clear, and as is consistent with prior testimony, the language you have in there now is good, is needed. I'll just say it this way. It's needed and it's good. And especially when combined with the other subsection you have in there relating to hours of operation, permit conditions for forest-based or forest enterprises that add value to forest products. I would say similarly, it is needed and good. I do think I would comment on that one that it's a pretty small step from what we've heard from Vermont businesses in this sector, but it's a good one and it will help. There's more there, so we can get to that, but it would be helpful. It's needed, helpful, and I think appreciated as you have it. So those two combined, as I said last time, make a pretty strong powerful combination. I understand you have thoughts about combining this package, even with other things, say in the downtown realm, and I will leave that to others to speak to, but I understand that as well. And I see the thinking. So I'll pause there. Just I guess maybe I'll finish the three. The third one would be the road rule, as it's come to be known, and understand that, and have tracked that and followed that. And simply, that's as I understand it, that's not something. I think the administration has concerns with that, and so I'm not able to, speak in support of that one. Perhaps others can speak to it better, and I'd leave that there. But so those are 2 out of 3, pretty darn good, and I think it would be, I guess I know there are folks listening. Maybe there's new folks interested, and I don't ever want to just gloss over things, but the fact is, this has both of these provisions, as I've spoken to them here, the hours of operation, permit conditions, and the forest fragmentation language. They've been in the works for a long time. They've been extremely well vetted. There's been a lot of testimony on both. But again, I'm happy to go all the way back to the beginning and explain to anyone why they would be needed, how they would be helpful, et cetera. But that's where I'd jump in, and I'll pause there, commenting on those elements of the bill so far.
Right. Thank you. Any committee questions on Commissioner Snyder on that? Okay, well, great. The fact that we're so much generally in agreement and it takes so little time to restate that, that's progress in and of itself, that we've come a distance. So I had mentioned before your report a year ago to the committee, helping us see, I interpreted it as you laid out a whole comprehensive view of opportunities for improvement, support for forest and the forest economy back in 2015. And then you helped us track what had happened in your report last year. And I think seeing that there's no questions about what we have in the bill at the moment, then it'd be great to go, take a prioritized revisiting of that list and say, particularly knowing that it's this committee that you're talking to, what opportunities are there for us to help put our shoulder to the wheel on some of these other aspects that you think are languishing or ready for work.
Great. Well, I hope it has been or will be useful. That is the testimony I provided on April 15th of 21, where indeed, I think I titled it, so it's revisiting forest health and integrity, an update on work accomplished and recommendations for the future, presented to your committee. What we tried to do there was recognize that, listen, yes, there was this fairly long report in 2015, followed by the report on, recommendations on maintaining forest health and integrity, a follow-up to that in 2016, a handful of other related partner organizations continuing to track data and report on it, and testimony, et cetera. So there's been a lot, and in fact, we have done a bunch of things, and I say we, meaning together, this community of legislators, administration folks, professionals have, it's a good list. So what we thought we would do then with that report last spring was just say, okay, let's go back through and say, what have all these recommendations been? Which ones have we done anything on? And we list in this report from April, each of them by category. So there's outreach and education on forest values and benefits. There were 5 buckets, right? Originally, of the sort of what we call buckets for policy consideration. They were outreach and education on the importance of forests, increasing landowner incentives to keep forests, investment in strategic forest land conservation, ramp up our approach to land use planning and regulation, and where forests are concerned, and support for sustainable forestry and the forest economy. We proposed that those are 5 elements of any comprehensive forest policy statewide that sought to thwart parcelization, fragmentation, conversion to non-forest, inappropriate impervious use, et cetera, erosion of function. And would, so it's this multi-pronged approach, these 5 kind of categories. And then within in subsequent reports, in each category, we say, well, for incentivize forest land ownership. We've been very careful in stewarding and improving and modernizing the current use program, recognizing it's 2 million acres of forest land, private lands, kept out of development. I mean, first do no harm. And then we've done things like improved the land use change tax, the so-called penalty in current use for development, as an example, right? So we just thought we'd go through, and there's so many of these recommendations in each bucket by bucket. What are the things we've done? What's left? And then I think what we'd like to do now is pivot and say, well, some things have changed in the world. There are new pressures. Maybe there's new opportunities. What else should we do? So what you have here is this listing of what's been done, what's partially done, what's not been done, our recommendations for where to focus. And what's not in here, and I'd really love to also have, is that next layer of, okay, we're getting serious about climate change. That really wasn't necessarily the case in 2015. For some of us it was, but not so much, right? We didn't have global pandemics and supply chain interruptions, resilience questions. We weren't thinking about equity, diversity, inclusion all that much, I'm sorry to say. So the world has changed, and we are changing as well. And I think that would be fun to consider what else. But you do have a good starting point in this April 15th testimony that kind of outlines it. It's not exactly scintillating reading, folks. I'll tell you that right now, but it's all there.
Speak for yourself. Come on.
So, I mean, Jude, your committee assistant mentioned before going on here that she was going to try to find that for y'all. Senator Bray, you had indicated you might. I don't want to like read stuff to you. I can, or kind of walk through it and touch on things.
I emailed it to all the committee members.
There you go.
Good.
And I don't know if everyone can see their email while they're still Zooming. Some of us have one device, some have two, but it is on our committee page. Again, it was Revisiting Forest Health and Integrity from April 15, 2021. So yeah, there's, people could, I think, look at it again at their leisure, and there's a lot of interesting information in there. There's a section on forest carbon, which we haven't really talked about today yet.
Right.
But I think we're just, I don't want to be in the position of asking you to pick your favorite child. Like all these things are important, but in terms of what we can strategically sort of get a wrench on in this committee in the next couple of weeks, if we're to try to enhance the bill we have in front of us, I think that's the kind of practical angle that I'm sort of revisiting your list from. Like, are there relatively discrete things where we could say, oh, well, let's consider adding that provision or doing some more work there.
Yes, I think
a lifetime of work ahead. Right?
Yes, and it is good to see there have been things that have been done, changes that have been made, and I think there are good outcomes from them. We're already seeing, so that's good. And but looking ahead, sure. In the context of kind of an Act 250 bill, I think, as I mentioned, I'd start there. That in all of these buckets, I frankly, we've done in landowner incentives. Other than paying landowners for the ecosystem services they provide currently and have for a long time, there's not much left for us to do. We have a robust current use program, need to keep that in good shape. But otherwise, what's the marketplace? So you mentioned carbon, that is a possibility for payments. There are other schemes that are possible. That's an area, but other than that, developing kind of payment for ecosystem services, we're really good at incentivizing landowners, supporting them with education. We've got this great cadre of licensed professionals, our staff. We all take it very seriously. There's exciting developments in silviculture and forest science that we are applying in a climate lens. There's a great swell of interest in understanding indigenous ways of knowing and applying it in our practice and our craft of forestry and silviculture. It's really exciting times. We're really good at those things. I'm going to steer us, other than be really careful with current use. I'd look at the others. Forest land conservation, more strategic. We've got Vermont conservation design. That's the idea of a more strategic approach to conservation, instead of reacting to possibilities or opportunities as they pop up, which can be valuable, but having this strategic lens of a functional landscape, an ecologically functional landscape to guide it. I think we know what to do. It's about support for conservation, acquisition, stewardship, legal monitoring. It's really about resources. We've got a great community of practice and professionals. We know where it is. I think as long as we have willing sellers, willing buyers, there's a bright future for enhanced strategic forest land conservation. It needs funding, and it's not just to buy it or buy the easement. That's actually relatively easy part. It's the ongoing monitoring, legal defense, and stewarding of the property and its public values that come from it. So I think we're in a really good place there. I hope my friends in the conservation sphere would not cringe. And there's always more to do, but I think I would look at that as we've made good advancement and we're heading in the right direction. Can we talk about? I'm sorry, please.
So a quick question, and then I'd like to, Senator McCormick had his hand up. The quick question is, for forest land conservation work, do we have a relatively steady fund? Is it affected at all by the surge of federal monies or anticipated federal monies? In other words, do we have a surge in opportunities there, or are we on kind of a steady as she goes diet?
In terms of new funding for acquisition and protection of land?
Yes.
It's mixed. I mean, VHCB got a chunk, sort of an extra chunk for conservation, and that's, a great hub through many partners and implementers. We're not seeing it, say, at our department from our normal channels of federal funding. That's not been among the funding. We haven't seen much of it, and so otherwise the kind of the ARPA and the CRF kind of funding has been more infrastructure related and access improvements, which have been really great. I think a little bit of conservation of acquisition, but not a whole. So it hasn't been a huge influx or this new opportunity here, not directly that I know of.
Okay, so, well, I just thought I would ask. I mean, it seemed like a bit of a stretch, but on the other hand, it's not really a stretch to call the forest the lungs of the planet. So
No.
if you want to talk about a deep definition of health,
it's natural infrastructure. That is, and it's cost effective. It avoids, there's avoided costs. I'll always return to this. It's just such a beautiful example. We've got some historians in the panel here, right? Think about the city of New York making a choice to not invest billions in a wastewater treatment facility and instead investing in forest land conservation in the Catskills as their water protection. And it's decades in and it's going great. That's natural infrastructure. It's not a buzzword, it's real. And we have an opportunity to take advantage of it. I'm pointing out my window here. So lungs and underground piping, filtration, it's a lot of things. So there's and you've heard from better than me on the return on conservation investment. This has become a serious discipline. It's not just happy talk. There's direct benefit. It's a good investment. I can't say it any more plainly.
All right. So Senator McCormick, then Senator Westman.
Thanks. You a few minutes ago said be careful about current use or something like that. Could you just elaborate?
Yes, current use is, I would say, the most successful and important conservation program we've had in our beautiful state, warts and all. So it's a complicated act, and therefore it becomes difficult whenever. I'd start with this. Whenever we lift the hood, in my experience, it gets a little crazy. And I think we have something very important here. If we zoom out, I'd say it's a bit of a Band-Aid. And maybe if we had a different approach to property taxes that were maybe based on use, as opposed to the development value, maybe we wouldn't need it. that's a recommendation, frankly, from me, but that's a much bigger one. That's the beginning of a biennium. That's everybody all in. That's tax policy. And I'm quickly running out of my lane here. But that's what I'd say. So we start with that. It's really important. Has outsized importance. I don't think any of us realizes just how darn important it's been in so many different ways. And so it starts there, Senator McCormick, and then I'd quickly go to, and it's complicated, and you got to pull on one thing and it pulls on another. There's hold harmless payments to towns. There's mythology throughout the program, from its white collar welfare to, you have to cut every tree every week. It's so quickly it gets a lot of noise and not a lot of signal, a lot of heat, too little light. And that's just an opinion of mine. And the problem is it turns out bad. We make mistakes. And I think the other body has a bill going now that considers changes in eligibility to reflect an interest in the importance of old forests and to consider a more permanent protection. And we're working with them on a way to maybe make that happen to achieve those goals of accelerated attainment of old forests and old forest function and value through current use enrollment by changing up the way we require people to manage their land, basically. That's a lot right there. That's a historic change. And with good intent and really strong possible outcomes, it could also wreak havoc on the ed fund or relationships with landowners. So it's just fraught, and that's all. I don't mean to be over dramatic. I just mean it's wicked important. It's complicated, and those make it worth paying really careful attention to when we have sweeping ideas for how to fix it. When I call it a bit of a jalopy. It's a jalopy. It's held together. It's been changed over the years in piecemeal fashion without a comprehensive approach. But it's a darn good jalopy, and Vermonters ought to be proud of it.
It's our
think-
jalopy.
It's our
Over the
jalopy,
years-
and it's treated us extremely well, is really the bottom line.
Well, over the years, I mean, I've been a strong supporter of current use for years, but over the the complaint I usually hear is a kind of a resentment. You mentioned white collar welfare.
Yes.
Yeah, but more than white collar, sort of Rolls Royce welfare. The idea is that they're rich people with large expanses and they're not paying. And then people will say, well, we're paying their taxes.
Right.
And I say, well, actually, no, we're valuing their land on its use rather than on its potential market value, and they're not developing it. So
That's right. But and your mileage, one's mileage may vary. I see Senator Westman's hand is up, and I go way back with him talking current use, and particularly back, was it 2015 when we changed the land use change tax, the penalty with y'all, and in part in response to that kind of gaming and parking of land in current use, which I think has shown to be limited, but
every time I enjoy a walk through one of my neighbor's woodlots, I say, thank God for current use. I live on other people's land.
Senator Westman.
So I do buy that we're in a good spot. I do appreciate all the stuff we've done. But we seem to be turning a corner where we're losing forest land to some degree. Also, we're seeing larger lots broken up. And when larger lots get broken up, it becomes, it's not good for any number of reasons for the forest and the management. And that's particularly on the private side. I think we can come in an important piece is conservation of large tracts, but given the amount of resources in that is a slow piece of this. So what I don't want to do is wake up years from now, hopefully, 20 years from now, and I'm still ticking around as a completely old fart, not just an old fart. But I don't want to have let a moment slip when I didn't address why we're losing and that breakup of large lots, which makes it harder. So why are those things and what are the things I need to do?
Great. So a lot there. I'd start with this. Even then, Senator, you'll be out skiing me and most of us, I'm sure of that, when you were in that condition that I'm not going to repeat.
Yeah, well, are you older than I am?
I don't think so. It's close.
We're about the same age, so.
So, okay, great. Let's call the question. This is about the recognition that our forests are unbelievably important and valuable in so many ways. And we're seeing a net loss of forest land annually that should be alarming. It's not the sky is falling. We're still in a relatively strong position, but it's worth noting. That's the point in time we're at. And I think my bigger point here would be, thank you. And there isn't one answer. There isn't one policy. I wish there were that you guys could just do. That's why I talk about these buckets. This is not a forestry issue. This is a Vermont issue now. This should be in every committee of jurisdiction. And I actually am quite keen on speaking with you, Senator Campion, should you be interested in the educational component here of the long-term view of the role of forests in our lives. And so from workforce development to human literacy about the forests of home. So I don't mean to pick on education. I'm just using it as an example of this touches every dimension of life. The answer, that is, to how do we stem the tide of forest loss? It's an economic issue, it's a labor issue, it's an education issue, it's a health issue, it's an equity issue. I mean, so I'm just trying to make a point and ask your buy-in that we're going to have to take a comprehensive approach. And I was trying to make the point that we've actually done pretty well in these broad buckets with driving towards, well, where are the gaps? Where are the ones left? We need to continue to peck away at incentives and conservation. And I was in the current use category there mentioning, don't do any harm. Senator McCormick asked, what does that mean? And I think Senator Westman's bringing up, like, there are pressures in current use of like, enrollments are increasing, but check it out. Number of parcels is increasing at a faster rate than acres, which is making Senator Westman's point. And so what does that mean? How should we respond to that? It's still in current use. Now we have, instead of one 100-acre lot, we have 4 25-acre lots. They're still eligible. Now we've got, instead of one landowner, we've got 4 landowners engaged with the land, talking to their neighbors, raising their children, voting a certain way. I'm not sure it's all necessarily one direction, but it's a trend that we ought to, and it's expensive. And then it brings us to, our staff tasked with bringing public accountability to all of this. And 2 million acres for 13 people with a requirement to visit every one of them every 10 years and to see plans turn over and meet high standards and ever-changing standards. It's a lot. You have a report from us on that too, you asked for, or someone asked for, and you got delivered a report on our capacity to administer the program. So there are pressures. And that's what I mean by when we look at, well, what's this deal with, increasing numbers of parcels? Instead of just reacting to that in a current use change, let's keep the big picture in mind when we attempt to adjust any one of these. That's the point I would be making in response to Senator McCormick. And in response to Senator Westman, yes, current use is this piece. We have to continue to monitor and make it work. But it's I love the idea of what are we going to do? I think in broad strokes, we're going to have equitable taxation on the land. That's current use, one way or another. Then we need to empower landowners. We need to retain that land. So we need to continue to work at the intergenerational transfer issue because it's been identified as a key in the near term of turnover of land. So that would be something to focus on. You've got a report. We've got a lot of good partners working on sharing information. Maybe there's more there, though, in terms of policy about generational transfer of land. And then we move to like the land use planning. We've all done a bunch here. You're contemplating a piece now, which would, I think the forest frag language would be kind of the last piece. Act 171, you saw Mr. Fidel give a really hopeful report on how that's actually changing local planning relative to forests. We should all be really happy. But here you have one of the last pieces, I think, to have a forest lens in Act 250. We continue to strengthen and support local planning. Where if we're making decisions about the subdivision of forest land in the, at the planning office, it's too late. This needs to happen in families prior to there. It needs to happen at the kitchen table, as we like to say, that conversation. And so I think that's what I'm interested in. Is we've done the support to municipalities. You may be looking at, landing this fragmentation language in Act 250, which will be helpful. What's the gap there with just empowering and making people proud to own a piece of Vermont and value that for what it's worth? There's something there. The big finish here on the sort of buckets, we've done a bunch in all of these, some more than others. And I think the last piece, the companion piece in S234 to the fragmentation is this idea of, as I would like to say it, you would be valuing by contemplating a modernization of how hours of operation permits are used in Act 250, particularly where climate change impacts on deliveries and movements in and out of a facility. It's an example of supporting. It's a way the way I would put it is, as I like to see it, is this is valuing the conservation effect of a sawmill, for example, or a firewood processor or a kiln. It has an effect of keeping forest. Geez, Act 250 logging is below 2,500 feet is exempt from Act 250 with good reason. But the receivers of the products of that logging are not. And I'm not saying they should be, but I am saying they're not a residential subdevelopment. They're not a box store. And I think they should be seen differently. And you contemplating an hours of operation shift that's very surgical, very precise, very much based on living experience among Vermont businesses. It's a great signal that we're saying maybe we can think of these as being a little bit different. I'm not sure I'd ask the same thing for a commercial facility, some sort of industrial facility otherwise that doesn't have the same conservation effect on the land. And if we don't have these facilities and they are shrinking, then we're going to lose our last chance to hold on to this forest land, because all the planning, all the incentives and education and warm and fuzzies don't matter. I've heard 3 experts now relating to another bill in the House about sort of a 30 by 30 idea of conserving 30% of the land by 2030 in the sort of more natural lands. Based on Vermont conservation design, 3 experts testifying that, we're in a really good position, like a climate resilient landscape that we have right now, relatively speaking. None of them made the point, though. They all attributed it to reforestation since our agricultural, clearing of the mid 1800s. Sure, but it does a disservice to the family owners that have stewarded this land now for generations and through active management, including current use. So I think what we're saying is this is a piece. We've done some things together with, like, on the forest economy side, like having a viable marketplace. We've propped it up with things like, the sales tax exemption for logging equipment, the incentives for wood boilers and these sorts of things. They're all good. But what we don't have is a sort of collective view that that's noble work, that we all benefit from it. There's a good life to be had in working in the woods and receiving facilities. And it keeps the money in Vermont. It is an alternative to fossil-based products, fossil fuel-based products, right? And so that's what we need to do, is with the whole big set of buckets, I think focus on this last piece of where else. And so I would say, if you wanted to contemplate something else, the House has a rural economic development bill going now based on a forest economy learning tour that the Rural Caucus took this summer, listening to Vermonters across the state and across the supply chains of the forest economy. And they've come forward with a package of items in their rural omnibus bill. It includes a kind of a strategic, like a farm to plate for the forest sector proposal. It has the hours of operations stuff. It also goes a little farther and says, what about changing this mitigation of prime ag soils for these same businesses? that maybe it's not 3-to-1 or 2-to-1, maybe it's just 1-to-1, or maybe it doesn't, you don't have, it's been noted as a significant cost. Again, this is a conservation kind of effect of the facility. Doesn't mean no siting constraints at all, but that's been raised and I would support that. This idea of looking at the prime ag soil mitigation pressures on a forest-based business in Act 250, that's ripe for change. They have also included, you may remember that there is a provision that says facilities of this sort, say mills, that receive, what is it, less than 3.5 million board feet per year that they process, they would go through as a minor application. Now, we all know that's a change of status that's not all that significant. It doesn't take much to bump it back up to a major, but that exists now. And they have a proposal to say, let's look at those numbers, make sure they're sort of the right numbers, and what kinds of facilities are those? And maybe we should just exempt those. That's in their package on the other side. And I think that's actually another reflection of, okay, this would be a significant change in how we view these facilities. And I'd like to offer that if you have trouble swallowing that, I'd like to think the thought of it as a conservation effect that's real can help that medicine go down. Then they also have a set of ideas related to trucking and truck weights, which is difficult, but it's basically recognizing that Vermont could, in some ways at least, benefit by raising the truck weight for log haulers to mirror more like to the states near us, New York and Maine in particular, but also increasing truck weights on state routes, but then also having a more sort of uniform and consistent and predictable approach to overweight permits on local roads through a portal at DMV kind of thing. So there's a whole set of things related to transportation of forest products that is in that mix. I understand that's not your purview clearly, but I offer it as just more of the kind of thinking that's come out of what is the problem out there with maintaining these, if you buy the premise, they're important businesses because they have this effect. Well, then if so, then we want to make them maintain profitability or perhaps reattain profitability. We want them to be able to grow. We certainly think this is the exciting part for me, is thinking about how do we attract new businesses that use new technologies, new products, new workforce, but have the same conservation effect. There are potential here. There is potential here. This is economic development planning. Again, not a forestry issue. So the forests have done their part. It's time for the rest of us to think holistically and comprehensively about our approach to forests, the people who work the forests and the people who work the products of those forests and what they do for us. It's all out of whack. It needs to be modernized. And with climate change in particular, and the growing importance of our forests and the threats to forests all around the globe, our reliance on timber from the Northwest is not long lived. I don't know if you noticed, but the Northwest is on fire pretty much all the time. There are real shifts coming in global use of wood. We are well positioned. We are this largest intact deciduous, temperate forest in the planet. It's in relatively good shape. It is seriously threatened. This is a mechanism for Vermont to do its part in a regional economy to provide the backbone for keeping forests, generally speaking.
Thank you. I see Senator Campion's waiting patiently. Senator Campion, thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I may have asked this at the last meeting, and I apologize if I already have the info has already been sent, but I'm trying to find where we rank in the country compared to other states with forest loss. Because, as usual, or often is the case, we look to some of our partners that may be doing it better. We also want to learn from some of our partners who are doing it worse. Is there that kind of information out there?
Yes.
And I apologize if it's already been sent.
No, I don't. It's a good question. I don't think it has been, not from us. So when I report to you on extent of forest, condition of forest, type of forest, and changes in all of those things, it's based on our work here, building on the work of the Federal Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. My point is, we're basing a lot of our numbers on that, and so do many others. And that they don't do that just for the state of Vermont. That federal agency does that for all states. And so that those data are available, kind of tracking forest loss in all states. We can provide that. My sense is we're actually in a pretty darn good place. Most, as state forester, I visit and have meetings with other state foresters from all around the country and territories. And what I hear is, man, you're lucky. We're small, we're still human scale, people get it, we're heavily forested, we still have a tradition of working with the land. Most of the things we're worried about happening here and that are threats to our forest have happened in Connecticut, have happened in Maryland, have happened in Minnesota, and they're all struggling. And many of the ideas we bring is because we've heard these from our colleagues in other states and other parts of the country.
So
That
is
said-
this, for example, are Maine and New Hampshire, for, when we think of some of our, I guess, New England cousins that would be somewhat similar to us, are they in a worse situation? Are there things that we could learn that from them that they might be doing better, or just making certain that we avoid some of their mistakes? I mean, I spent a lot of time in Maine, and I've never really thought to compare the two in terms of understanding, who's protecting forests better.
Yeah. Well, let me be clear. We have far better fall foliage. Maine, I'll give them the lobster every time, but we have the better foliage. Maine is so much bigger. It really is. And
Right, but there must be ways to measure, of course, sort of like we measure population or COVID outbreaks based on population density,
Yes,
area,
exactly.
that kind of thing.
Yep. Yep. You can, and they do. But it's not an apples to apples is what I'm saying, is because
Sure.
Maine starts with being really way bigger, particularly in terms of forest land, and way different. They've had an industrial presence of ownership, integrated operations and ownership for decades. So their ownership patterns, then they have the seacoast thing. So Maine is just really, really different, with a lot of different pressures and different ownership patterns. But we have learned, and we do share, and we can give you the basic trends. I mean, basically, if you look at Maine, what it looks like is the southern coastal tier is just unbelievably overwhelmed by development pressure, and everything north of Augusta is in some stage of recovery from repetitive industrial management that's only recently kind of changed in its approach. And we're not really looking that, we just don't have that. So some would apply that to us.
So if you do have something, if there is a document out there that would just show,
I will find something
where we fall, throughout the country, are there states that are being more progressive to protect? Are there some ideas out there? The Council of State Governments is one, we can always have folks in here to talk to us about, what they might be trying, but just trying to get a sense of where we are. And then I just love to look to the states that if we're doing the best job, great, others can learn from us. But if there are states that are trying new things, I'd like to get a sense. So if I could just get that, I suspect the feds have it, a list of 50 where we might fall. That would be great.
Well, I don't know that list exists, but we'll create the information for you and provide it to you that
Great.
shows
Thank
where
you.
we rank. And so remember, so we are right now the fourth most heavily forested state. Maine is first. Okay. New Hampshire's second. So consider the data. What does this mean? Because I would put Vermont's forested condition over New Hampshire's any day of the week. And I'm constantly reminded of that by my ecologist friends. New Hampshire's a great state, but they have twice as many people as us and a whole different development pattern. And, I'm not running anybody down here, but they have more forest than us, but we have better forests and a better approach to them. So forest land conservation, Senator, Vermont is seen all over the world as a leader in conservation practice and always in the vanguard, always evolving, changing, and leading. So we'll get you numbers and just know, to your point, we want to learn from them, what's good, what's bad. We do that all the time. we have a staff of professionals who are engaged internationally, nationally. They don't do this just to cash a check. It's what they do. I am advised by them daily, and as well as our partners all around the state. And I think you should feel good that we're not laying back or missing things. We're bringing you the very best ideas, frankly.
Okay, great.
And
Well,
can I just
Senator
say,
Westman, please.
so your presentation that you handed out last April and I just I'm trying to put this in context. It talked about by 2050 that we would be losing somewhere around 325,000 acres by 2050, which, I'm not sure how to equate that and measure that and do that. But if I'm right, and there are about 640 acres per mile, what that really means in forest land is this state's going to lose about as much forest land as my county is in size.
Yeah, if that was basically saying, I think these numbers, they shift some, they're not perfect. But as I said last time, there's a handful of different credible estimates of the rate of forest land loss. They vary from a few thousand to maybe 14,000 acres a year. They all say we're losing land. So that's just the take home.
No,
that number there, Senator, was just saying that if you kind of continue that rate, then over time, that's the cumulative loss. And it's kind of a wake-up call, isn't it?
I'm just saying that, I'm not saying that we haven't done well or anything. Just for me, in my county, which is less than 500 square miles, and if I figure it out, what you're suggesting is if we keep on the track that we're going to lose as much forest land is a little bigger than the size of Lamoille County.
Yes, this is a good way to represent it. And that's what we're trying to do, is to say, even when we're talking about acres per year lost, it adds up. And down the road, it can be appreciable. And so that's what I'm agreeing with you. We put that number out and just sort of played it forward to say, hey, now's the time to think about this, because we're not there yet.
And I only say that in relationship because when I get this and what they talk about, a huge piece of what they talk about for the climate change plans is the sequestration of carbon from the environment. And if I'm going to lose that much forest in a small state like this, it's not insignificant.
No, retaining forest land has to be part of it has always been part of any credible response to climate. Every commission, blue ribbon panel, intergovernmental, whatever, they've all recommended first, do no harm to the forests, plan, keep forests. It's true. It's the lungs of the planet. And so that's why, one of the many reasons I would say why we're saying we raised the flag in 2015 and put that report out. And it was not like we made it up. It was in response to several things that came before it. And we said, let's get it all on the same page here. And that's the point, is that that's too much to lose, or we need a plan, because there's so much that goes with that Lamoille County size chunk of Vermont forest land going away. Enormous benefits to individual Vermonters go away, and costs go up when we lose that forest land. That's why we're talking about it. I totally agree.
All right. Well, I think, we all have this keen sense of wanting to do more. And if we're frustrated,
Great.
it's only because we're not quite sure what our best next steps are to take. But we have some time to plug away at it, add some more. The bill already has meaningful changes. I think we're going to look to see if we can build on a little more before we vote a bill out and send it to the House. I'd like to pivot to a regular visitor to the committee also, Mr. Hancock. So if you could, maybe because some folks who are tuning in won't have met you before, you have your hand in this work in multiple different ways. And that's especially helpful to the committee because you have different perspectives you can bring to the discussion. So good to see you again, and maybe you could introduce yourself, and then you know just what we're talking about. So we'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Great. Thanks so much, Senator. Yeah, for the record, my name is Charlie Hancock. My day job is as a consulting forester based up here in Montgomery, working across the northern tier of the state. I also serve as the current vice chair or private sector lead for the state's Working Lands Enterprise Board. I'm also the president of Cold Hollow to Canada, which is a regional conservation partnership established over a decade ago, working around conservation, forest stewardship in 7 towns up around the northern spine of the Green Mountains. I also served on the Ag Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Climate Council with the report Senator Westman just shared. And I spent about 15 years in various aspects of local government, most recent being about 6 years on the Montgomery Select Board serving as chair. So yeah, I do kind of see a lot of this through different lenses, whether it's conservation, working lands, community, rural economic development, things we want to see here in the community. And as it's been pointed out multiple times in the conversation, all of these things intersect. They are not happening in a vacuum. They are not by themselves. And so this kind of a conversation is great, because I love kind of just the wide ranging, you know, different aspects that we're pulling together here and elevating together. I want to thank the commissioner. I think it's great. I think I'm glad Mike's in the seat that he's in right now. I'm still a little miffed that he made me use a dot grid way back in UVM when we have GIS technology, but other than that, I think he's fantastic. So I appreciate the chance today to come and meet with the committee and talk about this. I do have some specific comments around S234, but again, happy to kind of branch out into whatever aspects the committee is interested in discussing today, because again, all these things kind of fit together. So go ahead. Yeah, Senator.
Sure. So thanks. I think if we start with 234, maybe we have a chance to get on to some broader discussions. I also asked Ms. Chakowski to join us today, our counsel, and to have her look at some past bills where we were working on the same issues and to bring forward some language previously considered or developed to help us turn a more amorphous conversation into like, okay, so well, what's some language you might look at that actually makes a contribution along those lines? And I want to make sure that we come back to her by 11:30. So let's aim for something like that to transition to looking at some past language that helped us look at forestry issues. Okay, so
yeah, perfect.
Back to you, Mr. Hancock.
Thanks. Yeah, as you point out, I think a little bit of deja vu. I've been in this committee a few times talking about these principles, whether it's, you know, going all the way back to, gosh, H233. I mean, we can name various bills, but it's not the first time we've discussed it, and probably not the last too, which is good. So subject to S234, really glad for the invitation to come comment on the forestry criteria here. You know, I think S234 really demonstrates the importance of Act 250 as a tool in land use planning to ensure that we keep our forests as forests, which we've said is our overarching goal, and as well as a tool to strengthen the working lands economy, which, as Mike has pointed out multiple times, it does have a conservation effect at also keeping our forests as forests. I just want to say for the record, I support the effort to allow Act 250 to play a more meaningful role in reviewing the impacts of development on forest land. Specifically as it strengthens the criteria to minimize forest fragmentation, keeping intact forest blocks and connectivity areas. I also support the provisions in S234 to amend provisions that better support the working lands economy, specifically in the wood products sector. I think as we've talked about, previously today, Act 250 is just one tool in our toolbox to make sure that forests remain healthy and intact for all the benefits they provide. We've talked about the current use program, the importance there, the efforts of strong working lands economic development. The Working Lands Enterprise Fund is a great example of that. Local efforts around Act 171, local planning, and then some of the things that have come up here around working with landowners on stewardship activities, succession planning, actually getting down with them at their kitchen table, talking about kitchen table issues that are really tied in with how we're going to be successful here. So as it's been pointed out regarding fragmentation, Vermont, 75% forested, 80% of which is privately owned. So the management and stewardship of these private lands is going to be essential as far as the path to success in maintaining these forest blocks, connectivity areas, and the foundations for our working lands economy. You guys have already spoken about, the reports we've seen, the 2015 report, Vermont forest fragmentation, a more recent one from, I believe it was April, and then some work that our partners have done. VNRC has some great work. One of the reports tracking parcelization over time has really demonstrated kind of what's happening on this landscape. And anecdotally, I can point to an example right up the road here in Montgomery. Montgomery between 2010 and 2010 saw about a 20% population increase. We've slowed in this last census, but we're seeing the impacts of development, parcelization, and an influx of people here. I can tell you, the last 5 land transactions I've been involved with professionally with my company were folks coming from out west. When asked, what brought them here, each one of them said the fires brought them here. People are moving here. I think the term climate refugee is kind of an interesting one and might get used in certain ways that we might probably not want to use it, but people are moving here. And I can't help but think about, the person that sells their 2-bedroom ranch in Palo Alto and moves to Montgomery with $2.5 million in their pocket, what the buying power that has here, and how that can potentially lead to impacts on our landscape as they come here with their hopes and dreams. And again, everything's connected. I also see from my municipal hat the importance of broadband expansion, but I think about the fact that if we're going to have broadband to the end of every single road, all the way to the end of North Hill Road in Montgomery, that's going to change what people can do and how they think about moving here. I think that we have kind of a limited time in front of us when we think about things like that to really kind of address what those ancillary impacts are going to be on our landscape, things that we might not tie together, but certainly are tied together. Again, thinking locally, an example here of this kind of development, there's a 200-acre parcel up the road. They managed to skirt Act 250 over the past years by starting with a 9-lot subdivision, which bumped up to a 16-lot subdivision. And now we're looking at, instead of a 200-acre parcel, we're looking at 16 12-acre lots. Now in a highest priority forest block in this area, right in the connectivity zone. So these things are happening, and they tend to happen in a way where it's slow perforation. So it might not be this glaring, all of a sudden, boom, thing that just shows up in front of you. But when you look, they are happening. So the provisions of S233 will address these impacts by adding forest block criteria. As Mike said, I think this is an important lens that Act 250 needs to look at things through. I think some things in the bill that I'm glad to see, this bill retains the exemption for farming and forestry below 2,500 feet, which I think is important. I think the bill outlines a really robust and thoughtful rulemaking process with greater attention to definitions and kind of next steps as we work this through programmatically. The bill also proposes resource mapping, but in a way that is not a jurisdictional trigger. I know that's been kind of a concern in the past, but rather looking at resource mapping as a means to inform the review process, and equally as important to help assist landowners in planning for what they want to do. The development trigger here in this bill, which I think is good, is the road construction trigger rather than the location-based jurisdiction that we've talked about in some of the past bills. This is important because it leaves the opportunity for a landowner to design road networks in a way that avoids triggering jurisdiction. Essentially, they have the information in hand going into the process. They know kind of what the guardrails are, and they can work within them to both avoid Act 250, but also kind of meet the objectives here. So I think that's an important difference and something that I think I support. So, this will still allow for those small scale developments, an often example that's cited is kind of that we want to sell a lot to help pay for college, or we want to give a lot to our child. I don't see the changes here in Act 250 really, precluding the ability of landowners to do that. What this is doing is it's forcing any kind of large scale developments proposed for these areas to think about the considerations that we're all talking about here today. The working lands provisions in the bill in S233, I think are great. As we pointed out multiple times, working lands enterprises have a conservation effect. They are another tool, just like Act 250, just like easements. A vibrant forest products economy is right at par with those. And so I think that if we can keep forest ownership economically viable, we will also keep forests as forests. The provisions that are presented in S234 on hours of operations are, an important solution for forest-based working lands enterprises to achieve the goals articulated in the Act, while also recognizing the unique aspects and challenges these businesses have. Kind of different contexts than the traditional commercial or industrial development that we talk about in our rural communities. So I think it is important that we consider them differently. We've talked about a number of these challenges. I mean, climate change is kind of the biggest, most present one in front of us, and these changes we're seeing have real impacts on these abilities of these businesses to operate. We're seeing dramatic shifts in temperature, precipitation, which really impact, when we can get these products to market and how that impacts, our ability to maintain the viability of these businesses, really. And tied in with that is just also the ability to diversify, the activity of diversifying production or adding value to products which are traditionally minimally processed, make these businesses, make these marketplaces more viable and productive. And so while this hours of operation thing might seem kind of like a minor little transactional tweak, it's a pretty big deal to assisting these enterprises, which really form kind of the cornerstone of our state's economy and our way of life. I mean, like Mike said, look out the window. This is why we live here. And I do think it's just important, kind of high level, just to point out that when we talk about the provisions in this bill, it's not that the forest products economy is looking for a pass on regulation, but rather acknowledging that we look at different factors that affect us. As pointed out earlier, we're not a box store, we're not Walmart. And land use laws needs to take into account the differences here if we want to maintain the viability of these enterprises. So again, the changes in operation, I think, are a great step. Really happy to see them being put forward. Outside of the actual tweak it'll make for the enterprises operating in these spaces, I do think it's also a very important signal that's being sent here. Small things like this, small advances for the industry and for this sector are meaningful. It means that people are listening to us and we're being heard. And that really goes a long way to kind of, make us keep going, to be honest. Mike mentioned the Rural Economic Development Working Group that toured the state this past summer. We had a great visit with them up here. We talked about a number of things: sugaring, forest carbon, wildlife habitat, landowner stewardship programs, looking at peer-to-peer management. I know that they were in other parts of the state, and that was great because it was a chance for legislators to get out, talk with folks that work in this industry, really look at, what are the solutions that we want to see. I will note, as Mike brought up, there is a parallel bill in the House, H 581. That bill also gets at the forest-based businesses permit conditions, hours of operation. Again, as it's been said, there's other provisions in there around prime agricultural soils, which I think are really important to address if we're looking to kind of expand our lens in this committee. In addition to that, the permit exemptions for small sawmills are really important. And there's also language in there around recreational trails. Recreation is a forest product, and so if we can support that part of our forest economy, we need to do it. And then, as it's been kind of alluded to, there's other things happening in the space too outside of Act 250. We've got the Forest Futures Plan, which is kind of a opportunity to lay out a transformational roadmap, which doesn't just kind of get at the what do we want to see, tweaks to certain markets or things like that, but the how are we going to do it? It'll lay out a roadmap to what policy changes, what funding, what are the actual nuts and bolts of how we're going to achieve these things. We've talked about forest land conservation and the needs there, mainly around capacity and funding. We've talked about carbon, ecosystem services. So again, all of these things tied together, and I'm really glad that the committee is taking this kind of broad view to see how they all put together. So, some of these problems facing the industry, they might seem kind of marginal and one-off problems, especially when we're looking at kind of everything that's on our plate as a state. But I'm happy the committee is looking at this, and I just want to urge you to keep understanding that for this industry, what might seem like a marginal issue can be an issue that can tip something over a breaking point. And so when we look at, things like stats for permit approval and whether or not things like this might be needed, we also have to think about, what permits haven't been applied for because of the things that we're seeing as challenges now, and how we can essentially, make that glide path easier. So I'll stop there. I know that was a lot to cover, and kind of reiterating some of what Mike said, but a lot of it's important.
Okay, great. And that was just the right speed. Because then we'll dip back in with questions. And I do have a quick one. So working lands, I don't know if working lands has benefited from, even if federal funds aren't directly applicable to working lands, the federal funds may have freed up general fund dollars that could be applied. So can you talk just very briefly about what's going on working lands budget wise in the last year, and kind of what's coming your way in the coming year? Are we going to be increasing support in that area?
Yeah, so I think, with the capital infusion that came out of the last budget that was passed, looking at over 5 million that we're looking at now with this budget cycle, that's more than double what we've had in past budget cycles. And so that's been a huge just boost to the program. Every year when we put out the call for applications, we usually get back 3 to 4 times the amount of projects that we can actually fund. And that's just a testament to the need that's out there. So the current 5 million plus ask is greatly appreciated, and I don't mean to sound just, like I'm not happy for it, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
I know that there's some discussions happening right now around additional influxes of funds, as well as the need for a sustained increase in the funding for the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative. And I can't state how important that's going to be over the next decade, really.
Right. Well, and higher level funding and steady funding. I mean, steadiness is so crucial to being able to build something.
Yep.
And the other quick question is, so you mentioned, we have one thing that's always of concern to me whenever we invoke rulemaking is how well described are the parameters for the rulemaking. Like, are we going to get the product that we're hoping for? And so I don't know if you've examined the rulemaking section from that point of view of, does this suggest to you that we're framing up the rulemaking in a way that's going to really be helpful on the ground at improving our consideration of forests and forest impacts?
Yeah, I think from my read of the bill, and granted, I have not gone through a rulemaking process in any kind of capacity other than an outside observer. So, my firsthand knowledge is limited, but I think from what's laid out here in section 10 of the bill, I do think that you lay out, the very important points that need to be considered in a manner which I think provides for a very strong, comprehensive rulemaking process. I think that's one of the things about this bill, which is so important, is that there's a deliberative, slow process laid out here to address all the concerns that we still might have, even knowing that we want to support this and move it forward.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you. I mean, I say that as an open question every time we do rulemaking. So I'll ask everyone to keep their eye on that between now and passage. I noticed Commissioner Snyder indicated recreation and trails is not in this bill. We talked about trails last time. It was kind of a fraught area, and we thought that the different camps of schools of thinking, whatever, on trails management, development, etc. We know it's an opportunity. We know it's also a pressure, and this bill tries to stay quite focused in order to be a manageable bill, and we hope get it across the governor's desk. But I know that we've had big conversations in the past, and I just want to acknowledge in passing that the whole recreation industry component of this is something we're not talking about today, but we're certainly not. We don't mean to be ignoring it. It's just.
Yeah, comment, Senator Bray?
Yes, please.
I appreciate you and Charlie alerting that has been in this mix in the past, and it's indeed on the other side right now, at least in one bill. I would just say, yes, thanks for keeping it alive and being aware. Appreciate your sense about your approach to this particular bill and what you have in it. I just state, we continue to engage. We see trail making, trail maintaining, trail using is really important in the state. Lots of opportunity. Of course, we want to get it right. So we're still doing that with our partners in the recreation community throughout the state, and stand ready to participate in any contemplation of doing something differently. In the meantime, again, we continue to work at the agency on making sure we continue always to improve our approach to design, construction, maintenance, and use of recreational trails, including their attendant impacts, if you will. We deal with this on public lands and partner with private lands and volunteer organizations. It's just, I just want to make it clear, it's really important. It continues. And if there is a space and a place for conversation about how to bring things together so we can move forward, we would be happy about that. It is a forest product. I think it's a good way of saying it, as Charlie mentioned. I guess I'll leave it there. I appreciate that it's a topic. I don't know that it's all that fraught. I think that makes me feel like we're saying that there's a problem out there. And I guess I just want to go on the record and say, we should be really proud of the network of trails we have, the volunteers and the local organizations that hold it all together. And it's not like some major problem that we're all missing. I think we all want to envision better and forward. But I guess I just want to be on the record saying there's a lot of good here. This is another bit of the forests are the natural infrastructure for this really good thing. Right.
Right. Well, I'm, a great appreciator of our trails and for lots of reasons. And so I will confess that I read an article, I think 7 days, this summer about Burke or West Burke or wherever, I'm not sure which Burke, north, south, east, west, sort of having a traffic jam in town for the first time ever because there were so many people showing up to ride. And I think, so that's the kind of thing where there's a spillover effect from the kind of trail development. It's not necessarily the trail itself, but the facility has an impact on the town that hosts the system. And so we hold ourselves to a high standard in the state. And I think, we'll keep bringing attention to the issue and get this right. We definitely don't want to be, we're out to do it well. I guess that's where I'll stop there. Senator Campion.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to go back to Mr. Hancock's comment about the state. A lot of folks from the western part of the state, I'd say even probably other parts of the western part of the country, but other parts of the country also where they might be living near water and recognizing that we are going to see more and more people come in. And those folks, as he pointed out, I think quite accurately, might be selling a 2-bedroom house for several $1 million, and then coming here and buying up significant amounts of land. So my question is there a connection between when that happens and what the state's response is to it? In other words, if I were to move here from San Francisco, sell my condo, whatever, I've got all this dough now, I come here, I buy, 250 acres. Is there a response usually? I mean, is that, it's a real estate transaction, blah, blah, blah. But does somebody show up ever and say, hey, we know you've just done this. Let us talk to you a little bit about some of your options as it relates to using the land, as it relates to, as I think Mr. Snyder said earlier, just educating people. Is there a connection there?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few different points of intersection here. One is if they're buying a property that's 250 acres, my guess is current use is going to come up and they're going to call someone like me or consulting forester or county forester, right? So that happens. Another really important thing that's happened, at least we've tried to do it locally, is we talk with our real estate agents and we talk about these things with them and say, hey, as these things happen, we're a resource. I got a call 2 days ago from somebody who was looking to do just what you're talking about, and they wanted to talk about local zoning. What will local zoning allow? How does that work? How does Act 250 work? How does current use work? And so the more we can kind of create these spaces for conversations like that, the better we're going to be. And it's not just a state responsibility. I mean, we can layer things like Act 250, local zoning, those kinds of things together. But the key is to get all the players in the room and on the same page. And so that when those opportunities for conversations come up, we're there and ready to have them.
And then my follow-up to that would be, and I'm not sure if this is who, if anyone can answer this, maybe there's somebody on the committee. Do we know the last time this state or the federal government made a set aside land for a national or state park? I mean, I know state parks have been made or federal parks have been made, and they qualify for federal parks because they might be on 2 acres and it's the home of a president or things like that. But do we have a sense of when the feds have come in and said, okay, we are now most recently going to set this amount of land aside for parkland or to conserve it, recognizing that the deforestation that's happening in a particular state. I want to say the Obama administration, something like that, but I don't know if one of you could say something about that.
Happened in Maine pretty recently.
Federal or
That was federal, but my understanding is that most of this is not the federal government going out and looking for solutions. It's solutions being brought to the federal government. But
interesting? Okay.
State forest.
As you seem to indicate or suggest, we've indeed, in my time as commissioner, we've added several state parks. We've also added 2 state forest land significantly, thousands of acres, and created some new ones. So we continue apace. We have a very strong record of acquiring and protecting lands within FPR and with our partners at Fish and Wildlife within the agency and many other partner organizations. So that continues. We continue to designate new lands.
Great.
Those include some ecologically protective zones. We have natural areas with different designations within these ownerships, some of which include pretty hands-off approaches. So that's the sort of state lands, A&R lands. And that also includes, by the way, holding easements on private lands that become conserved. So that's all in our portfolio, and it includes many. 360 some thousand acres now in fee ownership, another nearly 60,000 in easements within the agency. The Green Mountain National Forest is at about 400,000 acres. They have a proclamation zone or boundary, and there are proposals to expand that. I think there have been some changes and adjustments and small additions, but no new designations of federal ownership. The only federal park would be Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Historic Park in Woodstock, and that's actually a relatively recent one and the only state national park.
So that's the other side of the story that I think we might be missing, in that if you could provide us with that list of state parks that have been created over the past decade, where we've actually stepped in, you or one of your predecessors or your teams, or this, that's the other part. I think that's important for constituents and others to hear, that yes, we have a situation on our hands, and there are multiple steps and multiple approaches to dealing with it. But we've also, the other side of that coin is that these lands have been set aside, these parks have been developed, these areas have been identified as areas that are really important to preserve, and the state's done so. So that would be, I think that's an important part of this that I think it would be helpful for us all to hear too.
I'm happy to hear it, and we'll follow up with such a description of the our holdings in what categories and what's been the change over time. That's great, because you're just giving me an opportunity to show that we have made progress together in one of these key buckets, which is conservation. Right. And we continue have a very strong record. It's not like without any federal help. I want to give props to the Forest Legacy Program, which is a federal program built basically and championed by Senator Leahy. We've done very well here in Vermont applying those federal funds to protect forest lands in our ownership and in private ownership in particular. So good story there. And I think you're right to say, hey, folks, it's not like we're sitting around. This is one of the avenues, one of the buckets that we approach this problem through. And this is a strong one for us.
And I think for most, when I think of a lot of my constituents who, different parts of Bennington County, it is, you're on a quarter of an acre, you've got a house, you're not thinking maybe as much about the current use, you're not thinking about these things and how all of these kinds of things are sort of coming together to protect land. You kind of want to know, just what I talked about. You want to know the story where, okay, in the past decade, this state has set aside these pieces of property for future generations and for animals and others to use.
right.
And
And in
so
all
that
parts
was
of the
covered.
state, there's some near everyone. That's a really cool thing about it. If I could briefly, I just touch on your original question, Senator Campion, about, it's a really good one. And about like when people come and they buy and what's the deal there. This is really interesting, has been an area of interest for me for a long time back when I was a county forester, because that's where the front line with our consulting foresters, sort of the retail face of all this, meeting with landowners at the kitchen table, et cetera. And it is a great resource. But it dawned on me that long ago that like, boy, I bought a toaster and it came with a owner's manual. Like everything I buy comes with an owner's manual, except when I bought property, there's no owner's manual. And most of us have come by forest land kind of accidentally. It came with the house. And it's even worse there because you just kind of have it and you don't even know. I've walked with dozens and dozens of landowners, didn't know anything about their land, where their boundaries were, and were thrilled to discover these things. So that says to us, wait, we need to change that. So as Charlie indicated, you've got these frontline folks just interacting with people and then doing things like really brilliantly reaching out to the realtor community. We've done that as a department. We've created programs, realizing they're the people selling this stuff. We got to get to them. And then we tried to create a Vermont Forest Landowners Manual. The Fish and Wildlife Department created a welcome kit, which was a sap bucket with some doodads and some information booklets, and here's some, frequently asked questions, and actually literally made visits to people. So we've come at this a bunch of different ways, but not in any kind of a uniform way. And I think it's really brilliant. It's where really there is an opportunity to connect with people. So many of them don't know what's at stake, how lucky they are to own this land, but also what sort of challenges might come with it, pitfalls, issues. And we have so much expertise, so many resources, and so much of it just doesn't go to the right people. And so you're focusing on something I think really important at that transactional point. How do we engage people in a more meaningful way that sticks? People like Charlie doing that retail level is how we do it now. We've taken some runs at it with kind of a program, open to ideas for how we could do it better and more, because I think there's a lot there.
I can just add briefly, I think the last element here is the peer-to-peer element. The more we can work with landowners who work with landowners together, the better we have, the more ambassadors we have. We've got a program up here that kind of looks at landowners on contiguous landscapes coming together quarterly to share a meal and talk about different aspects of management. But even broader than that, when you can get someone from the local mountain bike community to spout off that thing Mike said about how this is the last largest temperate broadleaf forest anywhere left in the entire world, you've got an advocate that's going to then go to that new owner. And so it's basically just expand the base of advocates that you have in whatever means possible, and that's going to help get you there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Senator McCormick. And then I think we want to pivot after that to hear from Ms. Chakowski on some opportunities and language from past bills. Senator McCormick. And we can't hear you yet.
All right. I hope Commissioner Snyder can take some comfort that there is no owner or operator's manual for being a state senator, and nor is there for being a parent. So could you, I want to go back a little bit earlier in the discussion where we were talking about state land and federal land. The distinction between that and a state or national park, that state lands are not parks, and the whole concept of multiple use, the kinds of use, including extractive uses to which public lands can be put.
Right. They're very different. I hope I can cover this for you. They're federal ownership and state ownership of lands they're very different from each other. And even within, there are many different categories in each. So on the state land side, we call it state lands, but remember, BGS owns lands, VTrans owns lands, corrections, right? When I say state lands, we're talking about A&R lands that are bought, managed, and used for the public for conservation and public use. So those are state forests, state parks, wildlife management areas, the latter being in the purview of the Fish and Wildlife Department. But we do this together and got, different funding sources, different kind of missions, but really shared, and the approach to managing them. So so the designations matter. It's all public A&R lands, but a state forest has a different administrative, it has a different name, and that means something, versus a state park versus a wildlife management area. Different purposes, different administrative approaches. So that's the sort of state lands, forest, parks, and wildlife management areas. Then we look at the federal ownership, and it's generally the Green Mountain National Forest. And that's within the USDA Forest Service, the National Forest System. But it's not the end of, and it would be very different than a national park, as you seem to know. A national forest has this multiple use sustained yield approach, whereas national parks are less managed. They're managed for people and people use, but not extractive use, right? So that's very different there. That's not that same separation or distinction between forests and parks at the federal level does not exist at the state level. We manage our state park lands a lot like we manage our forest lands, right? And then the federal designations within a national forest, you can have subsets like a wilderness designation, and that's important. And we have a couple here in the state, federally designated wilderness. Then outside of the national forest system, national forests, wilderness areas within, they have recreation areas, they have a bunch of different designations. But outside of that, you have wildlife refuges, which are in the Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a whole different federal agency, right? And they have public federal lands in the state. So the Conti, the Missisquoi, these are federal wildlife refuges, very different than a national forest or a national park. And we have some of those in the mix as well. Is this helping give you a kind of sense of how they're broken out? Did he say, yes, that was brilliant, Senator Bray? Is that what he said?
Senator McCormick, you're still muted. There we go.
What I said was that you were brilliant. No, I wanted to be clear because the colloquy between you and Senator Campion indicated that I was not sure that the committee was fully aware that these lands are not necessarily preserved. They are managed as opposed to being preserved.
Right.
Some state lands are preserved.
Correct.
Others
Significance.
not.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Some gets logged. We have logging on state lands. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
So thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Hancock. It's great to have you help us continue the work. I'd like to turn to Ms. Chakowski. We only have 15 minutes at this point, so we will ask her to come back another time and help us. I don't want to try to rush through every example you have, but it'll be helpful to go as far as we can in the next 15 minutes. And our apologies to starting a little late. We'll schedule more time to keep going and looking at past work that might be informative to what we're looking at right now. Thank you.
Thanks. Don't worry about me. I'm here all day, all week. Can you see my slideshow?
Yes, ma'am.
Is it full screen?
We see a current slide and the next slide.
Oh. Well,
But that's,
I don't know how to.
I think that's probably okay. Because
How about that? Is that full
there
screen?
we go. Now we're down to
Okay.
just one. Thank you. Perfect.
All right, great. Ellen Slakowski, Office of Legislative Counsel. As Senator Bray mentioned, he asked me to look back at some of the prior bills recently that contained language related to forest block conservation, protection, fragmentation. Because as has been discussed, S234 does contain some sections related to forests and forestry. So I have up on the first slide a comparison from this current bill S234 to H233. This slide and a bunch of the others hopefully will look familiar because I've given this presentation before, because your committee has looked at forest block language to be added to as a criteria to Act 250 before. In fact, you passed this language that's in S234 in H926 last biennium. That bill was ultimately vetoed by the governor. And so the language that's in S234 came from that bill because your committee did work on it. So on the right-hand side here, your bill S234 adds new definitions to Act 250 related to forest blocks, connecting habitat. Those definitions are then used in the new criterion that's being added to Act 250 Criterion 8. It also adds a new jurisdictional trigger related to the road rule, which you've already heard a little bit about. It then requires the Natural Resources Board to work with A&R to develop rules for the new Criterion 8C. And it also requires A&R's mapping to include forest blocks specifically. So I've lined that up with what was in H233, which is on the left-hand side. It also adds new definitions to Act 250 to be used in these sections. They are a little bit different, but fairly close. It then also added two new jurisdictional triggers, which I don't think this committee has looked at least in a few years. One that would apply to development that would be constructed more than 350 feet within a highest priority forest block as mapped in the Vermont Conservation Design Mapping System. And then for subdivisions, if a subdivision was going to be located in a highest priority forest block and outside of a designated center, 6 lots in a town with zoning or 3 lots in a town without zoning would trigger Act 250 jurisdiction. H233 added 2 subcriterion 8B and 8C. So there was separate for one specific to forest blocks and one specific to habitat connectors. Your bill just adds a new 8C, which combines them and uses the same language for both. H233 also changed the burden of persuasion under the Criterion 8 subcriteria. The H233 also added its own section related to the procedure for how to mitigate fragmentation of forest blocks and habitat connectors that are going to be protected under the new subcriteria. And that's actually pretty similar to how the Primag soil criterion works currently. It does require the NRB to adopt rules related to the new criterion, but it's a very short section related to rulemaking as compared to yours. And as you just started to talk about, there are different ways to prescribe rulemaking to an agency, and you may want to consider how much direction and specific direction to give to the agency when they do that. S234 and H233 take different approaches to doing that. S234, your bill has a very short criterion that's being added to Act 250. It's only it's only 2 lines, but the direction to the agencies on how to go about rulemaking for that criterion is quite long. However, H233 does the opposite. The criteria that are being added are quite long themselves, and they provide and they contain some details and specific examples of how the criterion would work. And the rulemaking section is only 1 sentence. So H233 is prescriptive up front and in the statute. S234 is shorter, but gives the agency more direction on what the rules should include.
Thank you.
So here's the language from S234 that was in H926. It's adding a new criterion under Criterion 8. And so as you will recall, when a project triggers Act 250 jurisdiction, all 10 criteria must be complied with. An applicant must submit enough information to demonstrate that they have met all of the requirements of the 10 criteria. The 10 criteria, most of them actually do include sub-criteria. So here we're looking at criterion 8, which is the ecosystem protection, scenic beauty, historic sites criterion. So you're adding new language down in C, which reads forest blocks and connecting habitat. The permit will not result in an undue adverse impact on forest blocks and connecting habitat. If a project as proposed would result in an undue adverse impact, a permit will only be granted if the effects are avoided, minimized, and mitigated in accordance with rules adopted by the board. Here's the rulemaking language. It talks about having A&R work with the NRB, look at how forest blocks and connecting habitat are further defined based on their size, location, and function, making sure there's publicly available information on these things so applicants can know if they have a forest block or connecting habitat on their site, standards for how a project can avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts of fragmentation, criteria for identifying if such a property is eligible for mitigation, standards for how mitigation should be determined, including ratios for compensation or conservation easements or use of on-site versus off-site mitigation. And it includes a working group. I did want to point out that it's very similar, but slightly different than the version that passed in H926 that passed out of the House. This further merged an existing criteria under Act 250, which is related to rare and irreplaceable natural areas. So in their discussions in the House, they thought that rare and irreplaceable natural areas are somewhat similar in concept, and some characteristics will be similar to forest blocks and connecting habitat. So they just added it to the new criterion C as well. There's also another version of this language that was in the predecessor to 926, which is the language that came from the Commission on Act 250, the next 50 years. And so I'm sort of going backwards in time. This language is a derivative of the H233 language. So it has a lot of similarities to that language. It is teasing out having two separate criteria, one for forest blocks and one for connecting habitat. But it is slightly different than what was in 233. You will see here on the first line, we have a forest block criterion, and it says a permit will not be granted for a subdivision or development within or partially within a forest block unless they demonstrate the following. And it uses an avoid, minimize, and mitigate fragmentation standard. So this is a criterion, it applies to every project, but it does actually ask an applicant to look at whether or not the project would be located within a forest block, and if they can do things to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. It does provide examples of how avoiding and minimizing fragmentation can occur, including locating buildings and other improvements to minimize disturbance of the forest block, like clustering buildings, designing roadways to minimize fragmentation. And then it's very similar in subcriterion C, which is directed at connecting habitat. So then, and that is very similar to what was in 233 as introduced. One of the changes from that is it first looked at whether a permit will not be granted if it was going to be located on or adjacent to a tract that contained a forest block. So slight difference. This is probably even potentially more protective because it's looking at whether or not there's a forest block adjacent to It then also used the phrase habitat connectivity area, which is a slightly different phrase, though it has largely the same meaning. Finally, it did have this additional language at the bottom, which provided even more specificity related to how a project ultimately got to a mitigation point. So at the very bottom, it did say that a district commission shall not issue a positive finding of fact based on minimization of fragmentation unless it finds that the avoidance of fragmentation was not feasible. And it shall not issue a positive findings of fact on mitigation unless it finds that both avoidance and minimization was not feasible. So that language did address a concern that there have been over the years from advocates saying, we have this language has an avoid, minimize, mitigate standard. And how do you know that someone isn't actually just jumping to a mitigation requirement and asking to either pay a fee or conserve another piece of land without actually doing the work of determining if fragmentation can be avoided on the site. So that is another sort of fairly strict standard that does require the district commission to make sure the applicant has gone through an analysis related to whether or not avoidance and minimization of fragmentation can occur. So then jumping back, there's these two standards of review that are different between your bill and H233. As I just mentioned in 233, we have this avoid, minimize, mitigate standard based on the idea of preventing fragmentation. It's a similar system that's set up currently for primary agricultural soil protection. The language in the statute as provided in 233 would have been fairly detailed, providing some examples and details with suggestions for how applicants could avoid and minimize their fragmentation of the land. But it then also added a new section under 6094, which went into even more detail and provided for examples and more details on how mitigation is calculated. S234 currently uses an undue adverse impact standard, and that is a standard that's used under the current criteria 8 and 8A. 8 is rare and irreplaceable natural areas. 8A is aesthetics. So you have probably heard of the Quechee Lakes test. It's a two-step test. It looks at whether or not there's an adverse impact that would be caused by the project, and then whether or not that adverse impact would be undue. So is it adverse? Is it in harmony with the surroundings? Does it fit in with the area? And then is it an undue? Is it too much of an adverse impact? Did the applicant take any reasonable steps to mitigate or reduce the amount of adverse impact that would be caused? So that is a different standard than avoid, minimize, mitigate. It does require rulemaking, and that rulemaking does mention avoid, minimize, mitigate, but it does then wait for the agency to develop a rule outlining what that looks like. So that's probably a good place to stop, because then I have information on the road rule and the other jurisdictional triggers that were in those other bills.
Okay, so I'll work with you and Jude on schedule, and so that we, is that sort of a midpoint in what you have, just so I have in mind about how much?
Yeah,
time we look for?
yeah, and I can keep talking. It's noon, but
no, I just mean
yeah.
that. Okay, so we'll look for like a half-hour block to be able to finish up and weave that into our schedule. Okay, so committee, thank you for staying, Commissioner Snyder, Mr. Hancock. Also, just for anyone who's viewing, we were talking about having, and so the committee knows, we were talking about having a public hearing on some of our fish and wildlife bills. It turns out that although Jude and I inquired last Friday about it, there's more to it than meets the eye in terms of how we announce a public hearing and the behind the scenes IT that's required to manage a much larger than our normal committee meeting. So that meeting will be rescheduled to the following week so that we can get all the resources we need without jamming anyone's schedule up. Sarah McDonald.
Is this on Zoom?
Yes, so thank you for that clarifying question. It will be an entirely Zoom public hearing.